This is a sample from our Exam 70-741 training. For complete training, including over 20 hours of movie training, as well as practice tests, chapter tests, movie tests, and flashcards, please go to itdvds.com. Response rate limiting is a way to prevent amplification attacks on our DNS server. And amplification attacks are when a little query is sent, but our DNS server is forced to send back a lot of data, a lot of information. And normally the way it's designed, the attack, is that it's designed to send that a lot of information to another server that the bad person is trying to attack. And they'll hit a bunch of different DNS servers this way, so it's like all the DNS servers, the different ones, point at this one server and send a bunch of information to it that it didn't actually request, and it becomes kind of a denial of service. So let's take a look at how to configure it. We can use the get-DNS server response rate limiting commandlet or the get-DNS server RRL. So they're going to function the same way. The same with set-DNS server RRL or set-DNS server response rate limiting. So the mode, this has to do with whether or not it's enabled or disabled. It's actually disabled by default. This can be set to enable or log only if we just want to log what it would have done to try to prevent those amplification attacks. It's still going to do it, but it's a good way to test out response rate limiting to make sure there is no negative impacts to your clients. Responses per second, this is going to specify the maximum number of times that a server sends a client the same response within a 1 second interval, so the default's 5. Errors per second specifies the maximum number of times that a server can send an error to response to a client within a 1 second interval. Window in sec specifies the period in seconds over which rates are measured and average for RRL. Response rate limiting is applied if queries from the same subnet resulting in the same response occur more frequently than expected in a specific time window. IP version 4 prefix length and IP version 6 prefix length. This basically specifies the size of the subnet in which incoming queries are grouped when we're trying to figure out if there's some sort of response rate or amplification attack and it needs to use response rate limiting. Leak rate. This actually specifies the rate at which the server responds to dropped queries. So if it suspects that there's an amplification attack, it will still respond to some of the queries. And the default here is 1 out of 3 queries. We can set this between 2 and 10. If we set it to 0, then it won't respond at all to queries that it sees as bad queries. Maximum responses per window, it's set at 1024. So we set the windows in seconds up here. Default's 5. And we already talked about mode. So let's say we want to enable response rate limiting. We can use the set-DNS server RRL or set-DNS server response rate limiting commandlet. Specify the mode. I'm going to make it enabled. This will update RRL settings on server DC01. Do we want to do that? You can see it's just updating the settings on the server that I'm currently on, DC01. Now if we want to set any of these parameters here, we can use the -Windows insec, -leak rate, all with this set-DNS server response rate limiting or RRL commandlet. And if we want to take it back to the defaults, we can use -reset to default. If we want to have it log only, we just change the mode to log only. As far as where that's logged, I could connect to this remotely, but I'm going to go ahead and just go over to DC01 here and open up our event viewer. And let's expand out application and service logs. Microsoft, Windows, and let's just scroll down to DNS server. And we've got our audit. We can see here where we actually changed response rate limiting. If we right click on it and go to view, we can also check show analytic and debug logs. And that will allow us to see the logged events of response rate limiting. And finally, if we want to turn it back off, we can use the set-DNS server RL mode disable. And finally, as a quick note up here, you notice when we enable it, it said response rate limiting can lead to a denial of service to clients if a flurry of similar requests are found to be originating from a common source. there's a chance that there's a bunch of legitimate DNS queries that come in, and the DNS server, since we've got response rate limiting set up, says, well, man, this looks like an amplification attack, so it denies their query, or it doesn't respond to it. So that's the potential downside of response rate limiting. As we talked about before, when we enable response rate limiting, there's a chance that we could have a bunch of legitimate queries and some of them could be dropped. Well, we can add an exception to response rate limiting if we know, okay, maybe a certain subnet, whatever queries come from that subnet, let them go, meaning respond to the queries. We could use a server interface. Maybe a DNS server has an internal interface that any queries that hit that interface, they should not be subject to response rate limiting. And we do this with the add-DNS server response rate limiting exception list. So here again, we're using the server interface. This could be a client subnet, and in order to use the client subnet option, we need to use the add-DNS server client subnet, which we give a subnet a name. We look at that when we get into policies for DNS servers. We could also specify a fully qualified domain name, and when we do this, we have operators here like EQ is equals, NE is not equals, and we can even use and or operators to make kind of a complex conditional statement which specifies whether or not response rate limiting should be used or not used.